Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum. And I want to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on what's driving the housing crisis in LA. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenblum Foundation. Tonight is the first in a four-part series on the housing crisis in LA, and in my opinion, this is the most urgent issue in Los Angeles right now. If you live here in LA, you know that in the past 3 or 4 years, we're seeing a huge amount of unhoused people living on the streets or in tents all over LA, in neighborhoods, on the sides of the freeways, under bridges, in parks, on the beach, and really everywhere. And I think the majority of Angelenos feel very concerned for the health and safety of all these unhoused people. And lots of people are also very frustrated that there don't seem to be viable solutions to housing them, or at least not quickly enough to satisfy anyone. Not just everyone, but anyone. It can feel really overwhelming and unfixable, and also confusing. Who's responsible for caring for all these people? Why is it so hard to build housing for them? How did this problem blow up so exponentially? What happened to all the money we voted to tax ourselves to alleviate the crisis? And what should we be demanding from our government, and what can we be doing as individuals? Part of why it's so confusing is that the housing crisis is not one thing, and it's not one group of people. There are many roads to homelessness, and prevention would probably need to take many forms. People returning from incarceration often have a hard time getting housing. Children in foster care often age out of the care system and into homelessness. People with children fleeing domestic violence need housing. And working people need housing, and the rents are too damn high and the salaries are too damn low. I've been wanting to put together a series of programs for a long time to try to tease apart some of these issues and see if we can clarify them a little and get some basic questions answered and try to identify some real common sense workable plans to move forward and house the unhoused. I got pretty flummoxed along the way, but then I met Anna Scott and I felt we had a good guide through this morass. Anna is a veteran journalist who's focused on housing and homelessness for many, many years. She's a reporter for public radio station KCRW, and she also reports regularly on homelessness for NPR's national programs. She created and hosted 2 KCRW podcasts about unhoused people, City of Tents, Veterans Row, and Samaritans. Before that, she produced the news programs Press Play, To the Point, and Which Way LA, and wrote for Bloomsburg Businessweek, the LA Times, and other local publications. We decided to break this giant topic of the housing crisis into 4 programs. So tonight is a kind of overall primer where Anna will try to set up the big issues with our guest speakers, and they'll try to identify and answer the most common questions and misconceptions about the unhoused while drilling down to the roots of the current housing crisis in Southern California. In June, we'll talk about the intersection of the mental health crisis and the homeless crisis and address the wealth of misconceptions about these 2 groups. We'll also talk about the debate over bringing back mental institutions and uncover some truths about the obstacles faced by both of these communities, as well as discussing what policies could really help. In July, we ask, where's the money? In 2016, LA voters voted in a bond measure designed to generate more than $1 billion over 10 years to create affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness. 6 years later, where's the housing? And what are the barriers to building more housing in LA? And finally, in August, we'll talk about what works. What are the answers to this ongoing, but ultimately solvable crisis? So tonight is our kickoff. What's actually driving the LA housing crisis? Anna Scott is our moderator, and she's joined by fellow journalists Benjamin Oreskes, Doug Smith, and Ethan Ward, all of whom have written about the housing crisis extensively. Benjamin Oreskes covers state and national politics for the LA Times. Previously, he covered LA City Hall, homelessness, and wrote their Essential California newsletter. And before that, he covered foreign policy at Politico in Washington, D.C. Doug Smith has been a reporter at the LA Times for over 50 years, covering local and state government, criminal justice, politics, and education. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting in 1997 and reported extensively from Iraq from 2005 to 2008. He specializes in covering where public policy meets real people. Ethan Ward is an award-winning journalist, public speaker, and podcaster. He's the host of Reputation, a podcast that explores and challenges preconceived notions about people whose lives, personally or professionally, intersect with the homelessness crisis. Homelessness is an issue close to Ethan's heart as he lived in his car for a year while attending community college. His reporting can be found on LAist 89.3, formerly KPCC, USA Today, Marketplace, and Capital in Maine. He did an award-winning series of articles in 2022 called No Way to Live, which follows the journey of one woman's housing insecurity. His reporting on the number of unhoused people who died in 2020 won a SoCal Journalism Award, and his reporting on unhoused people using buckets to defecate was used in an episode of HBO's Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. So tonight we're going to hear from all of these journalists with vast experience, understanding the tangled web of City Hall, NIMBYs, landlords, developers, gentrification, inflation, minimum wage, infrastructure investment and divestment, education, the VA, violence, social services, LAUSD, SROs, and the vast network of small nonprofits and churches trying to fill in the gaps with shelters, short-term housing, long-term housing, tiny housing, showers, bathrooms, access to phones, access to health care, access to veterinary care, access to social services and legal services, and all of the other myriad factors and stakeholders in the housing crisis. They're going to have a roundtable discussion and then take audience questions. And then I invite you all to join us for some coffee, tea, and cookies afterwards in the lobby, and we can talk about it some more. And if your question doesn't get addressed tonight, please, you are invited to write it down on a 3x5 card that's going to be available in the lobby, and we will look at it for the rest of the series. And you can also email us questions at info@hammer.ucla.edu. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest speakers, Anna Scott, Benjamin Oreskes, Doug Smith, and Ethan Ward. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, welcome. I'm Anna Scott, really excited to be here to host, as Claudia just explained, the first in a series of panels that'll happen throughout this summer. And in those discussions, there will be experts and policymakers, and you'll hear from people experiencing homelessness, but this is the only conversation that we're doing that consists of my fellow journalists, people who every day talk to all these different constituencies about LA's homelessness crisis and housing crisis. So this is almost like a lightning round kind of discussion where we're going to go over a lot of burning questions that we hear all the time from regular Angelinos about these crises, and hopefully cover a lot of ground. So with that said, I will just jump right in. I want to know from each of you, what is a top question? And I'll sprinkle this throughout the discussion tonight, so you don't have to, just one for now, but what is a top question that you hear from readers, from your listeners, from just regular people in your life about homelessness in LA? And what is your answer to that question? Why don't we start at the end, Ethan, and just go down the line?
Hi, everyone. I think the biggest question that I've ever gotten is, why don't people call their family? Why can't they just call a relative? Why can't they call a loved one? Why can't they go live with their parents? I think people vastly underestimate family ties and the access that people have to families. And there's an assumption that everyone has someone that they can call and fall back on, but a lot of people do not have safety nets in that sense where they can fall back onto someone.
Well, most of the questions I get are from readers, and they're usually two that just go together. One is, aren't they all just mentally ill or addicted to drugs? And the other is, when is it going to get better? And my answer is, some of them have mental illness, some of them are addicted to drugs. I have no idea how many, and I don't know when it's going to get better.
I'm usually CC'd on those emails as well with Doug, because we often write stories together. But I guess one other question we often get is, it feels like these people want to be out there, and it's usually followed by the questions that, or assertions usually, that Doug mentioned. And what I say to people is, the homeless population, like the regular population, contains multitudes, and there are people who want to be outside, and actually they maybe want to be outside for I think irrational reasons because the shelters they could go to are dangerous, or the PTSD they're experiencing, makes them claustrophobic, and that painting with such a broad brush is a folly. So, I think that's what I try to tell people.
Yeah, that is one that I get a lot as well, and sometimes it's even framed as how many people just want to be homeless or are homeless because they're choosing it, and I think there's a big misperception out there about that. In my reporting, I don't think I've ever met anybody that is unhoused because that's what they wanted to do. It's always an individual, complicated story that you really can't generalize about people who are homeless in LA County. It's 70,000 people or thereabouts. But I find that even if you meet people who at first will tell you, I'm not interested in any shelter, I'm choosing this. Usually if you spend more time talking to them, you'll find that they have a long backstory that at some point, of course, involved falling out of the housing market. And most people by and large do want help. Don't want to be in this situation, but maybe don't see a good option in front of them or have their defenses up and haven't found somebody to trust who's going to take them through those options. So I'm always a little surprised by the question. I guess it just speaks to perception that people have. But there's something that, in what you were saying, Doug, that I want to ask all of you about, which is I do find also that there's a lot of conflation that people will do about addiction, mental health issues, and homelessness, and kind of think of them all as one and the same. And although there's overlap, there are certainly different issues, and I think sometimes people grab onto what's most visible about the crisis that they see and sort of make generalizations. So I'm wondering how each of you in your work, or just when you think about this issue, how do you untangle those things from each other? How do you think about homelessness versus mental health issues, addiction? I don't know. Do you want to start, Doug? Because you brought that up.
Well, last summer I spent some time with Shai Rab, who is LA County's street psychiatrist. And he has a very practical view of it. He is looking for people on the street who have serious mental illness, which is either severe bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And he often encounters people who have serious substance abuse disorder, and he can't determine if the person has mental illness or not. So he tries to get them, those who he diagnoses as mentally ill, he tries to get on medication and then get into an appropriate place to live where that is designed for people with mental illness. But he said it takes about 2 weeks for him to sort out and figure out if a person is a candidate for that or should be in some kind of addiction treatment.
So, yeah, it's not something that you can just look around and have all figured out, in short. Mm-hmm.
I mean, one thing I would just add to that is, I think our eyes are our best tools as reporters, but they can also be very deceiving in the sense that think about your own experience, not getting a good night's sleep and what it does to you. Now imagine spending an entire night staying up because you don't want to be preyed upon or have your stuff stolen, and what that would do to you. And now do that every night for years, or the stabilizing effect of a good night's rest and a square meal. Not having that can really mask what your true state of mind is, and that stabilizing people is such an important part of helping them. And that's very different than resolving their homelessness through getting them connected to services. It's just a very discrete task, and we don't really have a ton of the beds to do that and help people in that way.
Yeah, when we talk about mental health as well and that overlap with homelessness, I think it's really important to point out that a lot of people that fall into homelessness likely maybe didn't have mental health issues until they were in that situation. And then once you're in the situation, your mental health starts to deteriorate because you're in a position where you've never been in before. I know me personally, when I lived in my car for a year, it was a constant battle to care, like to care about going to class, turning in an assignment. You really have to fight every day to kind of like get over that barrier. So I just want everyone to know that, yeah, you sometimes get into homelessness and then your mental health deteriorates, and we really need to get, really have more serious conversations about how we address that as well.
Well, also, Doug, you were saying something interesting before this, but when we were just talking outside before this panel about the mental health component of the crisis being something of an unknown, and I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit. I mean, we do have statistics on, there's the count every year, the homeless count, and there's numbers in terms of how many people are estimated to be experiencing severe diagnosed mental health issues. It's like something like a third of people experiencing homelessness at any given time in LA County. But you and Ben both have done reporting on that particular issue and questioned how accurate those statistics are. And so could you just talk a little about how you think about that and why you called it an unknown?
LASA conducts a survey, a 5,000 person survey every year, and they ask a lot of questions about
The LASA is the Homeless
the
Authority.
Los Angeles Homeless Authority. And they ask lots of questions about how you became homeless, how long you've been homeless, and what kind of medical history you have, and what kind of mental issues you have. Was mental illness the cause of your becoming homeless? And they produced those statistics and came up, for years they came up with a very low percentage of substance abuse and mental illness. And because I'm a helpless data reporter, I filed a public records request for the actual survey responses and was surprised that I got it and saw that they were consciously disregarding a lot of the answers, and the numbers were higher. But it still is not definitive in any way because these are self-reported surveys and there's no clinical diagnosis. Janie Roundtree at UCLA has done a massive study where she compared the homeless management information system, which is records kept by outreach workers, and compared that to county databases, DPSS, and the public health system. And she determined that probably 10% of the people living on the street have in their medical history a diagnosis of serious mental illness. So the numbers are all over the place. And from my perspective, mental illness is a big problem on the streets. The public perception of it is probably way out of proportion to what the problem is. But there are just hundreds to thousands of people on the streets who have untreated mental illness and their lives are just absolutely miserable. And the mental health system is not engaging those people in a meaningful way. And wherever you run into people who engage the mental health system in the courts for rapid diversion from criminal offenses to the outreach workers on the street to the hospitals, they just don't have beds for people to go. They know that somebody needs a medical bed, an acute care bed, or possibly a boarding care home, and they're always fighting to get them. And until that problem is solved, you have like 5 5150s, a involuntary commitment for every follow-up placement in a residential program. So the system is just churning people through 3-day commitments in a psychiatric hospital, stabilizing them and popping them back on the street. So a lot of work needs to be done there.
Yeah, I think one thing you said in there about the perception of how prevalent serious mental health disorders are being out of proportion probably to the reality definitely strikes me as probably true. It does seem that, people live their lives, go around LA, see people who appear to be having behavioral health issues of one kind or another, and will make generalizations. I do think that it can be easy to conflate all these holes in our mental health care system that can affect some people's path into homelessness, conflate addiction with homelessness, although they are separate crises. They're overlapping, and it can really complicate the individual solutions when you have a crisis of the magnitude that you have in LA County, and we're talking about how to solve it, and that's going to involve a ton of street outreach, ideally, and and it complicates how you help people who are currently on the streets off the streets. But I guess this is all leading to a question. Don't worry. But when you look at the underlying drivers of the homelessness crisis, I'll look to other places around the country, like with addiction, for example. The places in America that have the highest rates of opioid addiction they're not LA, not New York, not San Francisco. It's Missoula and Cincinnati, last I checked, for example, and they don't have enormous homeless crises. So at the root of all this, we have this housing affordability and housing availability issue that has plagued this region for so many decades, and people who are already vulnerable to slipping through the cracks obviously are slipping through those cracks. But I want to shift into talking about that underlying housing issue that's at the root of all of this. And not to keep you on the spot, Doug, we'll all jump in here, but I did, prior to this panel, find an article that you wrote for the LA Times in 1983 about a guy who was building little modular homes in El Segundo, and these were maybe going to be a solution to homelessness. It was this new innovative thing. And anyway, and there's other examples too, if I go through the LA Times archive, of just people looking for these out-of-the-box solutions for 40 years plus to this housing problem that we have. And, well, that guy has not solved it, apparently. And
Nor has Doug.
so what is going on? I mean, I want all of you to weigh in on this, and it's a big question, but why have we had so much trouble getting our arms around this for so long?
First, I want to comment on something that's not your question. Is it the fact, I don't remember that article, but the fact that I wrote that article is evidence that what we're thinking of as something that just started happening 6 or 7 years ago, it didn't just start happening 6 or 7 years ago. We've had people living outdoors in Los Angeles County, I mean, at least since the Depression. I don't know, probably before that, but I don't know about that. But it was just much more hidden in the past, and something did change, and I think partly it's just the number of people. But there were great debates in the 80s about how many homeless people are there, and those debates ultimately led the U.S. Census Bureau to try to count homeless people in 1988 for the 1990 census, and it was a horrible failure because they didn't know where to look. And it took another 15 years, but that led to the semi-annual count required by HUD that every community in America does now.
I just one quick anecdote. Doug and I wrote a lot about encampments on the Venice Boardwalk, and we found stories from 1985 or 86 about people sleeping on the beach and the consternation that caused neighbors, sort of, I don't know if we felt depressed or enlivened by that we're having the similar debates now. I mean, I feel like when you talk about the housing aspect of it, it gets at this larger issue that, I mean, Ethan can speak to better than anyone. It's it's not just the most visibly impaired people that we see in downtown LA or any parts of LA. It's this larger population of people who are sleeping in their cars, are sleeping in motels, and are just struggling. And we don't have a great handle on how many people. I mean, we have studies that speak to that, but it's not where the debate is necessarily when we talk about homelessness in a mayor's race. I mean, I look at this very much through a political prism, because I cover politics, and we seem to lose that, I think, in that larger debate. And partially is we are no closer to getting our arms around that crisis, and it feels vast and scary, and we let it get so bad that it feels daunting, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm not dropping the housing shortage and what is behind that, but yeah, Ethan, you have written a lot about LA's invisible homeless homelessness crisis, which is much bigger than just people that you see on the street. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, when we talk about housing, I think the biggest thing for me at least was I just couldn't afford rent. It really came down to an economical thing for me. It was like either I can pay to eat or I can pay rent. And I had to make a really tough choice. But I really want to point out the fact that Black people make up 8% of the population here in LA County, but we represent like 33% of the unhoused population. And I did a story, and I talked to Mark Vestal, actually from UCLA, the Luskin Center, and he was telling me that this goes back to, like Doug was saying, the Great Depression. It goes all the way back to racist housing policies back then that, according to him, snatched wealth out of the Black community, and then it kind of just kept going. And then you get to the 80s, and then you have mental health issues. There's a disinvestment of mental health. There's a lack of, input from HUD to come up with housing. And so what you see today is a direct impact of that. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. And so when I think about Black people, not being able to get housing, I think about how they ended up going to jail, because there was no mental health facilities for people to go into. And then you have a criminal record, and then that's a barrier to you getting housing. So there's a lot of different aspects and nuances to that conversation that go in, especially when it pertains to Black people not being able to have access to housing.
Yeah, well, it seems that the racial disparities in who is experiencing homelessness in LA County certainly go to the socioeconomic crisis that is really at the root of all of this. And so going back to the housing issue for a minute here, how did we get here to this point? We know LA does have a housing shortage for wonky reasons, but the city, like other cities in California, does assess every year how its housing supply compares to the housing demand and comes up with goals for housing. So we do have a way to quantify it. We can say we do have a shortage compared to the demand. That's impacted affordability. That's been building for many decades. But why? What have the big drivers been? I mean, how far back do you have to look to figure out the policy?
When you go to any other major world city, you see that they house their citizens in large, high-rise, huge villages with hundreds of 20, 30-story high-rises. And that's just not going to happen in Los Angeles in my lifetime. It probably will have to happen sometime. But I think the answer to your question is partly that these are very deep social movements that are I can't see, I can't understand, but they're locked up in our history. The development of Los Angeles after World War II, just this gigantic housing boom. My father bought his first house in Los Angeles for $8,000, and I bought my first house in Los Angeles for $20,000. And those people who came here and invested in the city are still invested in it. And my kids were able to buy a house, but if you weren't invested, you can't. And the city has really huge social divisions that leave the great majority sort of out in the cold. Even if they have housing of some kind, they're at a great disadvantage.
Now, I would just add to that. I'm blanking on the numbers, but when you look at housing production and permitting of new single-family homes in the 90s in LA, it was like 1,000 new permits. 3,000. They think we need 500,000 new units of housing. So I think it's just like whether it was a benign neglect or a perniciousness that stems from a racism and a NIMBYism that we can all talk about if we want. We didn't build enough, and we didn't build it fast enough, and people came here and the population grew, and those all fed into this thing where then it pushed more people and put more pressure on people who were already vulnerable, the people we were talking about with serious mental illness, with substance abuse disorder, put pressure on people, and the housing is one thing that is hard to hold on to if you are vulnerable in other ways.
And after the post-war housing boom, the land was used up, and it became harder and harder to build, but people kept coming, and they're still coming.
Do you think that that policies and attitudes around housing development specifically are changing now? I mean, my understanding is that, like in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, there was more of a political machine around the idea that LA is the city of single-family homes and it should be low density. And it does seem like now people are talking a lot more about the need for more housing. It seems like the state is doing some things to try to push that more aggressively than it has in the past. And I wonder, do you guys see any shifts there?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think like one prism into that is like the proponents of affordable housing in this state now are unions, and unions that had previously been very big vocal backers of single family housing, because who built that housing? They did. But now see, ensuring that project labor agreements and other requirements to use that kind of labor enter into these discussions has meant that political forces that had previously been very opposed to density are now very into it because they realized, oh, we could build it. And I think that's one aspect of it. I think there's many others as well.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? If not, I'll keep it moving because there's something else I want to go back to. Okay, no? All right. Well, we were talking before about invisible homelessness and the scale of the crisis actually being even bigger than what we see on the streets, even bigger than what's reflected in the official LAHSA count every year. And I think a county official told me at one point there's probably at least a couple 100,000 people experiencing homelessness in LA at any given time. Not 70,000, but they're the people you don't see. Maybe they're sleeping on a couch, et cetera. And I was wondering if, Ethan, if you could talk about some of the reporting you've done about just specific people you've met that that would fall into that category. And then Doug and Ben, I know you guys have also done a lot of reporting on the official count and how questionable it is. It comes out every year. It sounds like a very specific number. It's like 69,752 or whatever it is. I just made that up, but it's something like that. But it's not really that precise at all. So maybe Ethan, you can begin, and then you guys could talk about the official count.
Yeah, sure. The first person that comes to my mind is this woman named Faye that I did a story on. It's the No Way to Live series. And I spent 4 months with this woman. She works in the homelessness sector. Well, at the time she did. She worked for a nonprofit helping young people who had fallen into homelessness, trying to place them into housing. But she herself did not have a place to live. She was living between her grandmother's garage, her car, and motels all around LA for years. And I was blown away by that because I thought, how is it possible that you work and have a full-time job and you can't afford a place to live and you work in this sector? So she definitely was the first person that comes to mind when I think about the vast majority of people that are probably in situations like hers where they are working, they do hold down jobs, they just cannot afford to get a place in LA. And I've met a lot of the people that I've met during my reporting have similar situations. It's not that they're not working, they are gainfully employed oftentimes. They just can't afford rent. They can't reap the barriers that they have to get apartments, like making 3 times the rent, having good credit. And again, if you have fallen into homelessness and your credit is not good, that is also another barrier to you getting into housing. So like you said earlier, I just think that the vast majority, and we see a lot of visible unhoused people on the streets, oftentimes who are at their worst, but I think the vast majority of people are people that are like Faye, who are working and just can't afford to find a place to live.
Yeah, and we don't have any handle on that at all. It's absolutely right, and we really don't know anything about it. The count that LAHSA conducts every year is basically a street count. They just are counting people who are on the street, and then they combine it with a shelter count, which they get from the shelters through electronic systems. But they send out, they get volunteers, thousands of volunteers, and they actually go to every census tract in the county and look for people. And then they have minimal training to decide if you see a camper parked on the street, what's your opinion? Is somebody living in that, or is it just somebody's camper? And they don't try to count. They don't engage with people, and they don't try to determine how many people might be living in a tent. So the annual survey, which is a huge survey, 5,000 people, but it's because they spread it out over all the census tracts, or over hotspot census tracts. It gets to be small in some categories. They use that to come up with multipliers, and they say on the broad brush, well, 1.3 people live in every tent, and 1.5 people live in every RV, and so forth. And then they multiply that by all of the sightings, and they come up with an estimate. And of course, there's an upper and a lower bound to that estimate, but they never publish the upper and lower bound because, in fact, they have no idea how to calculate the margin of error. So they just give the number and down to the last person, as if that's. I really got into a tiff with them one year when they discovered an error in their programming. The people at USC, who I love the people at USC. They're very good. But they just haven't come to grips with this. They found an error in the programming, recalculated, and they changed the number by like 358, which was, when a reasonable upper and lower bound would probably be like 5,000 or 6,000 at least. It was just nonsense. But it gets a lot of people engaged, and it gives us some information, and we get longitudinal information so we can compare over years.
I mean, I think again, I think that the people, if I had the biggest critique I have of a lot of the people working on these things is that they do their work completely absent-minded of the political jungle that they exist in. So Doug often refers to the implied precision of this count, the point that Anna was making. It's this exact number, but that it creates this incentive structure where the mayor or the city council members are incredibly invested in like driving down the number in their area and not thinking about it in a more holistic way, which is that homelessness is dynamic. It's not this is definitionally a point in time count. It's in the name. But that like it maybe isn't the best way to like think about people being homeless. And there are researchers, a guy named Dan Fleming thinks about it. He uses like labor data to and like welfare rolls. And it's a much larger number, but he's not saying it's on one night. He's saying over the course of a year, this is how many people are homeless, and it's a much higher number. And that I think one of the challenges is that these numbers are created without a lot of attention to how they are then utilized by political candidates, interest groups across the ideological spectrum, and that they get twisted as a result.
Yeah. We've all probably seen some of the behind-the-scenes choreography that goes into the release of these numbers. If it's good news, you are guaranteed a big press conference, and you'll see county supervisors and city council members and everybody there. If it's bad news, they're going to delegate it to somebody from the LA Homeless Services Authority, maybe telling them about it at a meeting as if they don't already all know what's in the count. So
you remember when MRT called us all in like 2 weeks ahead of time, and they're not supposed to say what the number is, but he was prepping us for bad news. And
I do. Yeah, it was a very odd meeting. Yeah, I was there. Doug was there a couple of weeks before the count came out, and it was just to prep us for bad news. But I do remember leaving that and all saying like, "What was that about?"
But this all gets at a thing that like we're kind of circling, which is like the study of homelessness is very new. Like studying why people become homeless, who is homeless, like is a thing of the last 15 or 20 years. So there's very little research, empirical research, good empirical research, that longitudinal data, and the result is that we're left with Mark Ridley Thomas like trying to put his thumb on the scales of things as it's coming out, and yeah, I mean I think that's a big problem actually.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to leave people feeling like, gosh, this is just, completely hopeless and nothing is going right. So we will get to some positive strains, but I do think the governance issue is something that is important in LA that, if you're not really in the weeds of this topic, can just pass you by. But who is even really in charge of homelessness in Los Angeles, right? Because we've got the county supervisors who control social services, the city council members who have quite a lot of leeway to how they want to deal with it in their districts and their power. There's the mayor, who's somewhat limited, or, Scarcetti really liked to talk about, can't do anything. No, but and then you have the LA Homeless Services Authority. And it's unusual, it's unique. It creates some unique challenges. Or other municipalities aren't really set up this way. So, how do you guys answer that? Who's in charge of homelessness in LA? And how does this strange structure affect the actual policies when it comes to dealing with the issue?
Well, I think you're onto something about the patchworkness of it all. There are so many different players, and I don't know how that happened. I think that started with maybe LASA, with the way that they delegated things, but there's so many different players. You have the supervisors, you have the city council, and everyone has different roles to play. So it doesn't really fall onto one person's shoulders, and I think at least officials that I've talked to and sources, especially people that work in the homelessness nonprofit services, they say that there's always a lot of pointing fingers when things don't go right. It's like, oh, it's them over there, or they did it over there, and that really leads to a lot of confusion when it's time to get things done, because there is not one person that you can point to and say that they are responsible for this.
Back in 2016, the city of LA had, when Miguel Santana was the city administrative officer, they conducted a big project and produced a 100 and 200 something page report called the Homeless Initiative, and that was a prelude to the Measure H passing in 2017, and LA County created its Homeless Initiative to basically manage the money from Measure H. And in the city's proposal, they said, well, we need to name a person to be responsible for all of our homeless services. And we all thought, oh, they're going to name the homeless czar, the person who's really going to have power. And we should have known better, because they appointed a very nice woman, Meg Whitman, who was a classic city apparatchik, and basically all her job was to count the numbers and be sure that the numbers added up. I'm kind of high on Felicia Adams-Kellum. For the first time, we've seen LASA run by, really technocrats, really dull and uninspired, but ideological technocrats. It's a very bad combination. Karen Bass has appointed Felicia Adams-Kellum, who is the CEO at the St. Vincent Center, and has a really good track record and she gets things done, and she's a big personality. So I'm hoping that she emerges as a kind of a leader.
I have not much to add other than, the idea of the diffusion of authority means no one's in charge. I think is the ultimate way to describe the situation we have. And the result, I think LASA has homelessness in the name, but very little control over the things that create homelessness. And those are different problems, different things, and how you address homelessness and how you respond to it are very different in some ways, and that is a huge problem that no one has a good answer to solve.
Yeah, and you can see it at the city level playing out with things like council members not wanting to provide shelter beds or motel rooms to unhoused people who came from other districts, even though that's not really how people experience life in the city. You don't necessarily know what district you're in at any given time, but if there's somebody on one block and the nearest bed is in another district that is just a block away, there can be difficulties with that. So that definitely has been an issue at the city level, and it's be something interesting to watch to see how our still relatively new mayor deals with that going forward, because one of her promises was to have a citywide strategy on this issue.
And besides no one being in charge, just imagine the amount of energy that goes into all of these different groups trying to figure out what the other group is doing and how what they're doing fits in with it. It's very confusing.
Yeah. Well, you did mention Measure H, which was a county-wide sales tax that went to fund homeless services. And then there's also Proposition Triple H, which people are probably familiar with, which was the bond measure that passed in 2016 at the city level to build new homeless housings, permanent supportive housing. So specifically for people who have disabilities and were chronically homeless. So it's for a very particular segment of the population, but one that is hard to house. So I wanted to talk about those because this is a question I get all the time, and I'm hoping you guys can help demystify it a little bit. I get people asking a lot, whatever happened to that? Are they working? Are they doing anything? And these measures have definitely been criticized a lot. I mean, we've all played a role in that. I've written critical things. You guys have as well. But they are doing things. Prop Triple H, the housing bond, is really almost 7 years in, but bearing fruit now. There's something like 50 HHH projects opening this year, thousands of units. And yet, a lot of people still think of this as a failure. So I was wondering if you guys could help break down what those measures are actually doing and why the perception of them is so negative, even though they are doing things.
I'll diagnose the problem, why the perception is so negative, and then let Doug and Ethan describe why it doesn't work, because that's the harder part. Mm-hmm. It's so negative because, I mean, look at the streets. I mean, I think that's and while it's predicated on sometimes a lack of knowledge on people's part, you sympathize with people who are affected by encampments near their homes and also are wondering how their money has been spent and can't kind of come to terms with what is happening because their government has not done a good job of, bringing resources to bear, but also not explaining it well. And I think that inspires so much of the anger. I mean, we did a poll in the fall of 21 about 95% of people said homelessness was the biggest problem. And like anyone and there's anything about polling, it's like you never get 95% of anyone to agree to anything. It's like the poll. I remember the pollster being like, "I've done this for 40 years. I've never seen anything like this." Like the unanimity of people's anger, and anger that has an incredible amount of empathy connected to it, is very visceral. And I mean, I think it fueled the candidacy of Rick Caruso. He lost, obviously, but I think it also fueled a lot of what Karen Bass said. I mean, she gave an interview to me and a colleague of mine named Liam Dillon, where she said encampments on the street are unacceptable. And our mayor, Eric Garcetti, had trouble saying things like that. And he was, I think, a little handcuffed by his own sort of how his brain worked a little bit. I mean, he was just very worried about insulting constituencies, but that like Karen was speaking to a base emotion of people, and she was not trying to belittle homeless people, but she was saying it is unacceptable that we allow this to happen. This is not where people sleep, and that people responded very well to that.
It was a
now
failure.
You do the hard part.
It was a failure because the LA Chamber of Commerce and United Way got together and promoted it with a flashy campaign, basically saying this will end homelessness.
Which one? Or both? H and
Triple H.
Triple H. Okay.
And I asked them both. I said, the numbers don't add up, and they said, well, they knew, but they would cross that bridge when they came to it. And the other thing they didn't say is that the process that this money was aimed to, it wasn't to pay for these buildings. It was to sort of give a little extra money to make it easier for them to go through this horrendously complex problem of capitalizing these projects, where they have to go through rounds of NOFAs, Notice of Funding Availability from LA County, and they have to, and those are at different times from the when the tax credits are offered, and it's horribly competitive, and sometimes they go through all of this and then they don't get the tax credit, so they have to wait for the next round. And it was obvious it was going to take at least 5 years before any of these 10,000 units were going to be coming online. And when all 10,000 came online, there were never going to be enough to solve the problem. And then they created the coordinated entry system to it's a system for prioritizing people for a scarce resource. And the coordinated entry system, based on a acuity test, prioritized people with the most serious problems, health and mental health and substance abuse. They were the ones who were prioritized for getting housing. And you have some really good legacy organizations like a Community of Friends that has 42 buildings for people with mental illness. And they work so hard to stabilize these buildings and make them work. And then they are told, you have to take these people. They're given, the leasing was taken out of their hands and given to the centralized system. And so they get people right off the street who have serious problems, hoarding problems and substance abuse problems, and it blows up their whole building. So it didn't work because it wasn't thought out.
Doug, you did a great job explaining that. There was one point that came to my mind when you were talking. I interviewed Councilmember Marquise Harris Dawson for a story about this, and I asked him, why is it so slow? Because people keep asking me that as well. Like, what is the process? Why is it taking so long? And he brought up environmental reviews as a big obstacle to this as well. And that was something that never really crossed my mind, because California, we have all these great protections that are supposed to be in place to protect everyone. But then he said they ended up being an obstacle to developers being able to get buildings approved. And that slowed up the process as well.
But then we exempted it. It wasn't.
I don't know. I don't want to say anything inaccurate. This is almost getting too in the weeds even for me. But I will say with Prop Triple H, I think there was a big disconnect between, the wonky reality of how this was always going to work and the big promise that was made to get it to pass. And those two things don't really jibe. And maybe a misunderstanding on, even the part of people promoting it perhaps as well. But yeah, it was never going to solve homelessness. The goal was to create overall 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing. So this is housing for the neediest people living on the streets over 10 years. And that was always baked into it. And so if you just do the math, there's like 42,000 people experiencing homelessness in the city of LA. Maybe a third would qualify as chronically homeless and eligible for these buildings potentially. So it was never gonna solve homelessness or even chronic homelessness. And now the buildings are opening, but it's all, but yes, it's years after the measure passed. And so I guess I don't want, to give the false impression that, this went nowhere and it didn't do anything. I just got some numbers from the city in the last week, and there's something like 2,300 units open now that are partially funded by Prop Triple H, and that's going to double over this year and next. And we're sort of in the crest of these projects finally opening. And if all goes as planned, it will meet that goal by the decade mark, by 2026. But yeah, I think that people had a lot of expectations around it, and maybe that could have been tempered, but they didn't really match the reality of how this was going to work.
One positive sign is that because of the problems with Prop Triple H, I thought Major ULA didn't have a chance, and they didn't do a big flashy advertising campaign for it. United Way kind of learned its lesson, and it started a multi-year campaign of just community organizing. And ULA, which is far more money than Prop Triple H, passed pretty handily. And so in the next 10 years, there's going to be, we don't know how much, because it's a tax on homes of $5 million, I think, and people are stopping selling their homes, so the money might be less than they'd hoped. But over the coming 10 years, it's going to be billions of dollars. And they've also learned their lesson. They've dedicated about 70% of the money is for housing, and that's sort of split half and half between the old tax credit system, which is slow, cumbersome, and expensive, and what they call innovative housing models. And nobody knows what that means yet, but I'm hoping it means that they'll figure out how to use a little bit of government money and find a way for the housing market to produce affordable housing. Let's hope.
I do want to go in a minute to audience questions, but I feel like we need some kind of, I don't know, almost like wrap-up type thing here. So this is sort of a corny one, but we've all been covering this for a while. I wonder how you guys feel about. Do you feel at this point like this is an intractable problem, or that it's a solvable problem? And I will go first and say I still think, despite everything we've been talking about, that this is clearly a solvable problem, because there are countries in the world that don't have a huge crisis of homelessness, that have a totally different approach to housing, and we've even had success stories here. I mean, I did just do a whole podcast about the problems that still exist with veteran homelessness and the VA, and there are a lot of problems around that. But also in this country, there's been a lot of progress as a whole, not as much in Los Angeles, but around the whole country in reducing veteran homelessness over the last couple or decade or so, which is totally opposite of homelessness at large. So that's just one example of we do actually know what works, and we were able to employ it, at least for this one population that's a little more politically popular than the unhoused population at large. So I do think we know what works. I don't think it's intractable personally, but it's easy to feel that way when you're steeped in this all the time. But what do you guys think? Like, I don't know. You've been, is this hopeless? Are we ever going to get out of it? I know you said you don't know when readers ask, but tell me anyway.
I personally feel that it's not hopeless. I speak to people all the time who work in this space every day, day in and day out, and they know the answers and they have the answers, and they say the simplest answer is that people just need housing. And I just feel like once we get to that understanding that people do need housing, and I think this is also a product of our society as well, to be honest with you, our perception about how we approach people that are experiencing homelessness. I was in Dublin, and the lady, I interviewed her there who runs their homelessness stuff, and she said that they just keep spending money. And I said, and no one complains about this? She says, no, they need a place to live. We just put them in motels. And she was really mad. She was like, and I feel really bad that they have to spend so much time in these motels. And I just thought, like, well, maybe we can get to that point where we also all approach the situation where we're like collectively realizing that this impacts all of us. And if we are able to kind of get our heads around that as a society, then I do believe that we'll make a lot of progress. And so I like to be optimistic.
Well, I started covering this, maybe 8 years ago, when I was driving around the city and seeing more and more people living in tents on the sidewalk. And nobody at the Times was really paying attention to it. And so I thought, this is a problem that needs tending to, and based on my past experience, if you shine a spotlight on something that's going wrong, the people who are responsible for it get engaged, and then it turns around and gets right. Shows you I grossly exaggerated my own power, but I do think the problem, I think it's intractable, and then I think there will always be people who will somehow lose their housing, and we're always, even in an ideal world, we need a shelter system, and a good shelter system, because you have domestic violence, and you have people aging out of the foster care system, and you just have people who break up, and particularly women who have no resources. So we need that. We're never going to have a society that doesn't require a good shelter system. And unfortunately, we don't have a good shelter system. We have a terrible shelter system. But I do think that there's been a lot of attention on how to create density in Los Angeles with transit-oriented communities. And I believe that there's the possibility of things getting better in the future, but that's not a prediction, it's just a hope.
What he said.
What he said? Yeah. Okay, well, all we need is better shelter system, a lot more housing, and an entirely new social contract. But I think
and redoing healthcare and raising the minimum wage too.
yeah, but No, but not intractable. Well, I do want to go to any questions that we've jumped around a lot, but yeah, any questions that people here have. I think there's somebody who's going to come around with a mic.
I had a question for all of you about housing elements, and I mean, I've been reading a lot in the paper lately about Santa Monica being out of compliance, and it means there's a lot of like fancy new apartments being built, right? Do you guys think the state regime of these housing elements and like suing cities or their housing elements is actually working in terms of providing more affordable housing, or is this like a broken regime that isn't really working right now?
I think we don't know yet because it's relatively new that the state has been attaching teeth to these housing goals that cities are setting and going after municipalities that aren't meeting those goals. And it's also relatively new. I think that there are some developers taking advantage of this. There's something in the law where if these cities are out of compliance with the housing that they're supposed to be building, according to these state goals that they set, then developers can bypass the local zoning. I'm hopefully not bungling this, but they can bypass local zoning rules and propose larger projects and more density. And so it's the builder's remedy. And there's been a lot of news stories lately about developers in all around Southern California trying to take advantage of that with different proposals. But I think it's still relatively new. We haven't totally seen how this is all going to play out and hold up to lawsuits and all of that stuff. So I think it's hard to say. I don't know.
I think you're right, and I think that one of you mentioned the teeth or lack thereof. It is, our colleague Liam Dillon wrote about Coronado, which has basically went like that to the governor, and nothing happened, and so maybe that will change, and they'll start suing cities like that. But until they do, I mean, we're very limited in what we can do, the state is very limited in what they can do. Not we journalists, but as a state, we are very limited in creating more housing until these housing elements are sort of ambitiously rendered and then executed.
Yes, I'd like to address not the neediest homeless, not the people who have the hardest time, but there's also an upper end to homelessness. People who just had a terrible medical bill and just couldn't keep up and lost their home or couldn't pay the rent anymore or whatever. So I'm a senior. There are a lot of seniors. Many of them own their homes, and they're empty nesters, and they're not selling their property for various reasons, because maybe they don't want to pay, they think they're going to have to pay too much in taxes. But it has occurred to me for a long time that there ought to be a way that, quote, responsible people who are in an intermediate or temporary situation could go through some sort of a public agency or public organ or nonprofit organization and be matched up with people who have large houses and empty bedrooms on even like a temporary basis, 6 months, a year, where the homeless person can save money, and get ready to put the rental, when you rent a new apartment, you have to have money for the fees. And it just seems like there are a lot of people, I think, in Los Angeles who would be willing to have someone at the, quote, upper end who don't have, major problems of mental health or any, substance abuse, who they would be willing to share their home for 6 months, a year, and while these people who are working are saving up so that they can enter the housing market.
Well,
But
seems
it
like a
takes
good
somebody
suggestion.
It takes an agency who can chaperone that, because most of us don't know how to deal. If we get somebody in who turns out to be, Godzilla, we don't know how to get rid of them. And most people are just afraid. But if there's some kind of an agency that can interface and match
hear you.
up people and take care
Yeah.
of the few bad apples.
I'm gonna jump in, but yeah, I don't know, good idea, a sort of matchmaking service between people with big empty homes and people who need a room.
I think I heard a story on KPCC or LAS, about that kind of an agency that was operating, I believe, in San Diego. I've never heard of anything like that here. There is an organization called Share that leases empty homes. That is, people have moved out and they lease the whole home, and then they board 2 to a bedroom and maybe put 6 people in the home with what they call a peer advocate.
Just to add on to that, there are programs in LA that are kind of like what you're describing. I know the LGBT Center, they have something like that for people that come through there. So people that come through their center can get, I guess, mentors or get matched up with people to do exactly what you're talking about. But I definitely agree. I think that that's something that should be a concept that they take to scale. I'm optimistic, though. I mean, the controller put out like a call to landlords, I think, to say, like, hey, we need your help in this crisis. If you have rooms, let us know. Be part of our database. I'm not really sure what happened with that or what will happen with that, but I mean,
Yeah.
I guess that will be maybe a step forward.
I don't know, but it does also relate. We have more questions, but it does relate to something we were talking about before, which is the invisibility of most homelessness. I mean, most people who experience homelessness in LA County in a given year are in a situation like you're describing, but do manage to pull themselves out of it before ever landing on the street or ever getting entered into any system. So what we think of as homelessness is really just such a small sliver of everybody that actually experiences it in a given year in LA.
And then one thing that the homeless count has shown is that even though it's a point-in-time count, it's a count on one day, they ask people how long you have been on the street, and they use that, again, with a statistical maneuver to calculate how many people have been homeless at any time during the year. So we know that there are a lot of people who have, for the reasons that you described, may lose their housing, but somehow recover on their own, or they get help and recover. And it's a pretty substantial number. It's like
I think self-resolution was the largest exit out of homelessness.
Yeah.
People figuring it out themselves.
Oh, hi, I'm next. Hi, thank you, everybody. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm in real estate, and you know what they say, location, location, location. So the first thing you ask is, what's your budget? And then based on that, that's where you do your search. So I know the name of this lecture is The Housing Crisis, but could it also be called The Location of the Housing Crisis, meaning there's plenty of land when you go an hour outside of LA, completely open to be built, and it's cheap land and they could build, and there's less, holding back with permits, and they could build new, beautiful, great facilities for unhoused people and not crunched here in the city, and just spread it all out. And then people who, I was raised with living within your means, and you have to have like an honest assessment, like, hey, I can't afford to live here anymore. I can move somewhere where I could afford to live, or I can earn additional streams of income or get more skills. And I'm not trying to come across insensitive. I of course super care about homeless people and everybody, and I also have heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, I heard over 50% of the homeless population in Los Angeles or in California is from all of the other states. It's a nationwide problem coming here. And I think the other states need to take responsibility and take care of their homeless too, because we're running out of resources. We're overstretched, and I heard 7 homeless people die every day, and that's so sad to me. And I just wish there was more, let's go somewhere where we can afford to build and be self-supporting and not, I guess,
Well,
overspend in have like a homeless shelter in a very expensive part of Santa Monica. Like, can't they go build that like outside of Bakersfield and build like a brand new city and create opportunity and just create more of a spread out city?
Well, I
And
think-
and I'm sorry, I hope I'm not hurting anybody's feelings. I'm really not trying to do that. I just feel like this is a more responsible solution, is saying, okay, let's work and live within our budget.
Well, I think I'll just there's a couple things sort of baked into there that that I do want to address. I do think that it's not uncommon to for people to think that LA has this homelessness crisis because of the weather or because of people coming from other places to be unhoused here. But those are myths, really. Most of the people who are homeless in LA County were last housed in LA County, even if people were originally from somewhere else. I mean, a lot of people, and I'm from somewhere else. I'm from New York. So it's not true that people, by and large, come to LA to be homeless. Most people last were housed here. They're here for all the reasons that any of us are here in LA. They have family here. They have connections here, ties here, and so I think so that's one thing that complicates it. Also, I think if you look at the racial disparities and who's experiencing homelessness, it does tie back to many of the exclusive and racist housing policies of the past. It goes all the way back to redlining in LA, that the roots of this homelessness crisis that we have today. So I think when we think about solutions, you do have to take all of that into account. And I think it's easy to sort of put all the onus on personal responsibility and say, well, why don't we just, if people can't afford it, why don't they just go somewhere else? But I think that is also partly what led to this moment in time.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off what Anna just said, the majority of people that I've met living on the streets who are unhoused, they are from those communities. They have lived in these communities their entire lives. They went to elementary school there, middle school there, high school there. So that to them, that's all they know. And they feel like, why should I have to go all the way out to, I think you said Bakersfield or something like that. Why should they have to go all the way out there when they don't have ties or bonds to people in that part of town? They're looking for solutions that keep them in their neighborhoods, around their family ties, their friendship ties, the people that they've built community with here in LA growing up.
And I think you've raised a kind of conundrum because right now we have a homeless system that is packed with services, and you can't just build a project in Bakersfield or people have proposed the Antelope Valley and just send people there. First of all, you can't send people there. You have to they have to decide to go there, and as many people, they're close to their ties. And the other issue is that the people who live in those communities are primarily doing long commutes to work somewhere else. And so you're taking a population that doesn't have access to transportation and trying to convince them to live in a place where they'll be totally isolated. I just don't think that even if you built it, I don't think it would be very successful.
I just, not to pile on, when you look at the history of how Skid Row was created, it was it goes way back to when people came out on the railroads and where residential hotels were, but it also has a lot to do with them concentrating all of the services and shelters in one place, and the result was we have a thing now that is what Skid Row is, and that we're rational actors in the sense we go to where the things we need are. If we put them all in one place, then there will be all kinds of a certain type of person there. So I think part of spreading it out is about the equity of where these people are across the city as well.
Yeah, and the kind of city that we're creating. I mean, if you look at Venice Beach as a sort of case study in LA homelessness at large. I mean, Venice is an area that has quantifiably lost density significantly in recent decades. It's a place where consequently, and for other reasons too, housing prices have become some of the most astronomical in LA County. It's also a place that has lost diversity during that time too. If you look at census numbers, it's become whiter. It's lost a lot of Black residents, which it historically had in larger numbers. It's lost Latino residents, and it's also, it's long had some unhoused population, but you can see all of that play out there in this really extreme way. And it is also an area where there's been some of the most heated fights in LA over putting services or affordable housing projects or shelters. But it's kind of hard to divorce those fights and the current situation from all of that history that came before. So, I think there's just a lot baked into that.
Just one additional thing, the two communities in Los Angeles County that have the highest percentage of people who came from out of state or out of county are Venice and Hollywood. And that's really no surprise. And people didn't come to Venice and Hollywood to be homeless. They came to take in the beach and to maybe become a star, and it didn't work out. But throughout most of the county, a very high percentage, like 80, 90%, have been in the county for at least a year before they became homeless.
More questions?
At the risk of being unpopular, and I'm not afraid to be such, because there are values to single-family neighborhoods too. And Newsom, when he after the recall, the first thing he did was pass Senate Bill 9 and 10, where you can take and put density, and they talk about heat sinks in the middle of cities, and Santa Monica's underparked, and there is a value too of not forcing all this density. And there is a backlash, and if people have paid a mortgage their whole lives and worked to enjoy a community, and some authoritarian figure, the self-righteousness of the whole, our federal deficit now is $31 trillion and climbing, and all this largesse and all these ambitious programs to try to make things better are making it much worse for most people. So I think a lot of thinking needs to be done about letting local people create their own environments. And it may be true that I can't afford to live in Bel Air. I'm so sorry. Is somebody going to write me a big check so I can pay a $10 million down payment to buy one of those homes?
Well, I will say I heard the word largesse, which I do want to push back on, because I do think there is an idea that there's this, largesse, and there's all this spending going on. That's, all this welfare that's maybe making things worse. But fair. Okay, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but largesse. But I think, Karen Bass is proposing spending $1.3 billion on homelessness this coming fiscal year. New York City spends $3 billion a year on an enormous shelter system that they have. General relief in LA County is something like $200 a month, which is, for the most destitute people in the county who don't have other income, you can qualify for general relief. That number hasn't really changed since the 80s. And just, reporting on housed communities, the services are pretty thin. If every unhoused person in LA County tomorrow said, I want to go to a shelter bed right now, we would have not nearly enough. There's a huge shortage of all kinds of affordable housing, just regular cheap apartments, SROs, deeply subsidized housing, Section 8 vouchers. You name it, there's not enough of it. So I would say that if you are vulnerable to falling into homelessness, or you've already fallen in, the resources are pretty scarce. The outreach is pretty spotty most of the time. It's hard to get any kind of housing or even a shelter bed if you want it. I think there's sometimes an idea that there's all these empty beds and people are just turning them down, but that's not the case. Many of the beds are spoken for, and so that's one thing. But the other point about LA does single family homes are part of what make LA special. They're part of, there's something to be said for them. I mean, I don't think anybody here would dispute that. They are, and I've heard interesting, innovative proposals just in my reporting over the years from different people. Like I remember an architect laying out some plan about how, look, you could make this incredibly dense corridor along Wilshire Boulevard, for example, and you could concentrate all this density there, and then you could still have single-family neighborhood homes, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's like about taking away from people that have single-family homes or have wealth now, and giving to people, to others. I think that just the way that LA has allocated resources over all these years is part of how we got here, and there's not a lot of resources for people who are at the bottom of our economy.
So I covered the downzoning movement in Westwood and the San Fernando Valley in the 1970s. And what precipitated that was when people like Sam Gilbert, the UCLA booster, built 20-story office buildings right next to single-family homes. And it was an atrocity. And that really precipitated a massive downzoning all across the city, which now makes it very difficult to adapt to the influx of people coming into Los Angeles, because we don't have border control at city boundaries or state boundaries. And so the city is going to get more dense. Can't help it. But it's got to do it in a way that's less ham-handed and destructive as it was in the 1970s.
Hi.
Oh,
I
hello.
wanted to
I know you.
ask a question instead of a comment.
Yes, Rebecca. I know you.
Just your opinions on why the shelter situation is such a disaster in the city, and what could be done to remedy that.
I think actually COVID was in a moment that sort of bared a lot of the inequity that we haven't really talked about COVID as a moment that sort of shined a light on how messed up so many things are. And just really quickly, we were still out doing reporting throughout much of it, and we would go to downtown LA, and the only people in downtown were homeless people and construction workers, because construction continued and what was being built was not for these people. I bring that up to say that the people we saw on our streets were people, in many cases, who had left the shelter system because it had decompressed, because the way we have built shelters is to jam as many people into as small a place as possible. And I think if there's it's kind of a hard way of thinking about it, but the outbreaks and death that resulted because of how we've built shelters really was a wake-up call for people, and resulted in much more of awareness now to the idea that people deserve a room, and not not a room at the Four Seasons, but a room. And I think that has been a very positive development. Why we got to the place we got to, I think, is a little bit about how we view. It's sort of how we view charity a little bit, of we're just going to give you what you get and you like it, and efficiency. I mean these are limited budgets, the places that run these shelters. So I think that there's a real recognition that this is a market. If you want the beds to be full, you have to make it a somewhat approachable place. And if you make it a place where your stuff is going to get stolen, where you're going to get COVID, people aren't going to come into it. And I've been inside the Union Rescue Mission, been inside the Midnight Mission. They're not fun. They're scary places, and I don't blame a person for not wanting to go into that.
Yeah, I've lost count of how many people that I've met that have said that they'd rather be on the streets than go into a shelter, for various reasons, some that he just mentioned, but a lot of times also we're not thinking about the different experiences of people that have to go into the shelter. So if you are a woman fleeing domestic violence and you have dealt with assault, you're not going to feel comfortable maybe in that environment. I've met dozens of LGBTQ people, especially trans and non-binary people, that have experienced transphobia and homophobia at shelters, because just because you're unhoused and living at a shelter doesn't mean you can't be bigoted. You know what I mean? So there are a lot of different obstacles to being in a shelter that people have to overcome, and I really think that we need to really rethink how we approach shelters. And like he said, we often think you should take what we get and what we give you and be grateful for it. But that's not the reality of how most people live. Most people want to be indoors, but they want to have a door where they can lock and have some privacy. And that, if that's what we need to get people indoors, then that's what they're going to have to do to try to really rethink about how the rules that surround the shelter system operate in order to get more people indoors.
So there is some good news that the shelter system today is really a lot better than it was 8 years ago when I first started reporting. It's far from perfect or got many issues, but back then the whole system was pretty much oriented toward nonprofits and charitable organizations like the Union Rescue Mission, like Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, and Volunteers of America. And they would sort of buy warehouses or they had a lot of shelters in armories, which were, if you could picture like 2 basketball courts, and they would have 100 cots that would go up on the wall every day, and then at night they would come down and people would sleep in them. And partly as a result of media coverage and the LA Alliance lawsuit, Judge Carter has squeezed more shelters out of the city. We now have, Mayor Garcetti built, I think, 30 shelters that are supposed to be temporary, but they're going to be there until they fall apart. And there are now hundreds of tiny homes in tiny home villages, which is far from perfect, but it's, we talk to people in them, and the biggest problem is that they have to stay there for months. It's supposed to be a stepping stone into a permanent situation, and the permanent situation doesn't materialize. So sometimes after 9 months in an 8x8 shed, people just get burned and they leave. But still, the shelter capacity in 2005 was 1 shelter bed for every 4 people living on the street. And I haven't studied the ratio recently, but it's much better than that now. There's much more opportunity if that's your choice, and it's not everybody's choice, but if that's your choice, there's a lot more opportunity.
Yeah, I think one way to make it better too is just getting more input from people who have been through that system or experienced homelessness or are experiencing it now at the policy level. We know from reporting. We hear all the time about issues in shelters, and a lot of the issues that I hear about are that people aren't getting enough assistance in shelters. They're unpleasant to be in a lot of the time, but also they're not getting consistent case management. There's no clear exit plan, and then they're kind of languishing in this place that's not pleasant to be in anyway, so why stay? So I think, if policymakers got more input from people who have gone through that system, that would probably help improve it.
It's a problem. I was at the Alexandria tiny home village last week talking to a woman who had been living there for 16 months, and she finally got approved for housing. But while we were talking, we were out in the lunch area, and there was a guy who was harassing her like a bee. He wasn't touching her, but he was sort of just hovering around her, talking to her and trying to give her a cigarette, and she just kept saying, "Go away, go away." So, and that was, I'm sure after dark, even worse things happen.
So I think we'll do a couple more questions. I can't call
Hi.
people, so.
My question is whether or not there is a resource center for people who are on the street, to go to find out what their resources are. Is there a collective of information somewhere?
It's not as no.
Seems like there should be.
There should be, and it's actually a thing in San Francisco. They do this thing when they have these navigation centers. It's much more common. You can walk into some of the nonprofits, but it's much more difficult. There's not a lot of options.
We have a few navigation centers here where that's the idea, but 5 of them over 400 square miles of Los Angeles. It's not really accessible.
Yeah, I think the biggest resource right now is the county 211 system. And when you call there, they pretty much refer you to a nonprofit, and then you begin this process of calling a gazillion different numbers to find a place that could help you get into the coordinated entry system so they can then start to route you to the appropriate services. But I live in downtown, and if you go down by City Hall on Main Street, there's actually what they have a homeless help desk that literally has been empty and boarded up since I've been living down there. And I always just think it's like, this is, we're right here in downtown. There's tents everywhere. Why is there no one staffed in this building and it's boarded up? So, yeah, it's on Main Street. It's like
sounds
literally
like a good story.
right.
We're all like,
a few
where is
blocks.
that?
It's right.
Who's gonna do it
Yeah.
first?
It's right by City Hall East.
You've seen it, yeah.
It's right by City Hall East.
I have never noticed that.
Maybe we'll do like 2 more, and we'll call it a night.
What do you guys think are the biggest obstacles to creating more density in LA?
I mean, I would say opposition and lack of imagination.
I agree.
Me too.
Yeah, I guess that sums it up. Also, just it's just hard to do. Also, a lot of red tape.
Building in the city sucks, and it doesn't matter if you're building affordable housing or market rate housing. We need more of everything, and we've not made that an easy process for people.
Yeah, I think we'll take one more, and then we'll. Who's it going to be?
I guess just following that question, what role does like zoning and the time that permits take to build and process developments? What role does it play here? And obviously, I'm from the view that more density is better, at least in certain spots. Like you mentioned, the corridors, like in Wilshire, we see that in a lot of European countries. France, and they're doing great. It brings economic development, jobs, and just vibrant cities, walkable cities. But I'm just curious, what can we do different in terms of zoning and, changing that to make it easier for developers of market rate and affordable housing to be able to build more? Thank you.
We could probably have a whole another panel discussion. I will say this was there was a lot of red tape around building stuff in LA, and it was sort of like one of the lesser paid attention to elements of Rick Caruso's mayoral campaign, because he is a real estate developer, and he didn't talk about it much, publicly. But if you went on his website, one of his things that he wanted to do as mayor was create a fee. I think it was like a $15,000 fee or like something substantial for filing a CEQA lawsuit, which is this really wonky thing. But this is one thing that snarls development in LA, is that often large development projects will get held up by litigation from people who oppose those projects under this particular environmental law that California has, which has this acronym CEQA. And it's a law that's been abused just to stop development. It's, ostensibly on environmental grounds, but it has been the basis of a lot of anti-development lawsuits. And anyway, that was one of his proposals, make a big fee to try to cut out the frivolous CEQA lawsuits. That's just one tiny thing that I thought was interesting.
I've been talking to developers who are building affordable housing with social impact money with no government funds. And their biggest complaint is always the city permitting process, not the entitlement process, but just getting their plans through City Hall, where they would go to the fire department and get it approved, and then they would go to the building and safety department, and they would require changes that conflicted with what the fire department told them, and it would just be a never-ending battle. And these developers got Karen Bass's ear prior to the election, and one of her first acts was to order a streamlined process. And the developers tell me it's actually working. And the DWP is another obstacle where they have to get electrical connections, and that can just take months and months. And DWP has instituted a fast track program, which they say is working also. For now.
I'll be very quick. One of the sort of most depressing or kind of funny stories that Doug and I heard during the COVID was a lot of the permits require a wet signature, like literally a pen, and the offices were closed. So you could like literally the head of the housing authority couldn't sign checks and sign off on projects and stuff. I mean, so there's a whole conversation you could have about zoning and the amount. Not actually a lot has been built under SB 9, for example. it's just for however much it's been debated, very few projects have utilized that. So I don't know enough about that to really speak to it, but I think there's just this like really soul crushing process to get things done that could be examined much more closely and much more creatively.
Wah, wah. So we'll leave it there. I do want to say, just on a personal congratulations note, I don't think Claudia had it in her intro, but Ben here was part of a team at the LA Times that yesterday won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on the City Hall scandal, the racist tapes that were leaked at City Hall. So congratulations, Ben.
Thank you.
That's why he's the most casually dressed of this panel. It's like, I don't care. But no, thank you all so much for coming out for this. Really, this was fun.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
Absolutely.